My name's Sam Keene, and I work at Google, and I design virtual and augmented reality. And so I'm going to talk about the work that I do in AR and VR in relation to this idea of restart. And in particular, some of the research that I've done into the history of AR and VR. And that's the thing that I'm really excited about and then I get inspiration from. So I kind of want to share that with you. In particular, this period of early media technology from pre-cinema and how it relates to the work we're doing today in AR and VR. And I don't have the clicker, so I'm going to have to grab the clicker. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Awesome. Cool, but I'm just going to talk a bit about myself for a while and go way back to the late 80s and the early 90s when I had a Commodore 64. And I used to play games on my Commodore 64. And I was endlessly fascinated with how games work, and I wanted to know how to make them, but it seemed like this dark art, and I didn't know where to start. That was until I found these books in my library. And they showed you how to program games for your Commodore 64. And so I borrowed a bunch of these books. These are two of the actual books that I borrowed from my library. And I borrowed a bunch of these books, and I took them home, and I was really excited because I was going to make awesome games for my Commodore 64. The problem was that the promise of the cover of these games was very different to the reality of the games themselves. So they promised dragons breathing fire, and one of them had a battleship with a space invader above it. But the reality was that they were just text-based games. So I spent a lot of time building really lame text-based games, and they went something like this. You have entered a room. There is a dragon in the room. You have a sword. Do you attack the dragon? And then they'd always devolve into swearing and various other things that young boys are interested in. But I kept on programming and getting interested. I was still really into it, and I learned how to do what it was that I wanted to do, which was to light up pixels and to move things around the screen. And that theme, this kind of code and design and the overlap between the two is something that has carried on throughout my life and my career, and it's what I do today at Google. So I call myself a designer, but I design things with code. And I was introduced, this is a pretty bad slide for this point, but just bear with me. I was introduced to virtual reality at a pretty young age. So in around 93, 94, my dad is an oceanographer, and he maps he works at Sydney University, and he mapped the ocean floor of the Pacific Ocean and the ocean around Australia. And they do this with these big ships, and they have like a sonar device, and they like ping the ground, and they can get this kind of high resolution 3D imagery of the ocean floor. And they take that data back to Sydney University, and they had two rooms, and one of the rooms had this giant silicon graphics supercomputer. I'm not sure how familiar you are with supercomputers, but in the 90s, we had really shit technology. And so a supercomputer was kind of like a laptop of today or a mobile phone of today. But the really cool thing about it was that it was able to render 3D graphics in real time. So it could render these maps of the ocean floor and project them on this screen in the other room. And you could wear this 3D headset, and you had a joystick, and you could kind of fly through the ocean bed and into like the valleys and the ravines. You could come up into Sydney Harbour, and there were like shipwrecks and stuff. It was really cool. And so that was kind of my introduction to VR, and really inspired me to be interested in VR. And there's kind of this overlap between code and how it turns into graphics and code and design that is carried on to today. And so then years later, I studied at RMIT. I studied animation and interactive media. And one of the things that kind of sticks with me today, it's almost like the singular thing that I learned in that course, was the history of animation and the history of computing and the history of the moving image. And I found it really inspiring. And today I keep going back to this kind of history, these early days of animation and the moving image. And whenever I'm having kind of a creative crisis, like an existential crisis, why are we doing this? What's going on? I like to go back to the source of where these things were invented. And it kind of gives me, founds my trajectory and kind of takes me back. And I want to share some of that inspiration with you today. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. And another thing I did at RMIT was, it's hard to see, but we started, some of the other students and I started a renegade projection collective called Projector Obscura, And yeah, it's kind of like a pre-cinema reference there. We'd beg, borrow, steal for projectors, and we'd roam around Melbourne, and we'd project on buildings. We had a car battery, and it was a lot of fun. So that's what I did at university. And then, so I finished university, and I spent a bit of time working at a couple of agencies in Sydney and Melbourne. And then in around 2012, I moved to New York to work at RGA. This is RGA on 39th Street between 8th and 9th. It's a really beautiful campus. They've actually moved now, but this is the old campus where I used to work. And when I was at RGA, I was lucky enough to work on a bunch of really cool projects for Nike, including the first Nike Fuel Band and the second Nike Fuel Band. I did a lot of the graphics for the iOS app, and a lot of the animation and the interaction, and that kind of stuff. These are some prototypes, early prototypes of the Nike Fuel Band before they'd actually built the hardware. So we used to kind of strap these Velcro strips onto our wrist with a computer chip and wander around New York and test it out. And then I also worked at RGA's Startup Accelerator. We'd work with early stage startups, bringing their ideas to fruition. This was a game controller that I built there that's controlled by your breath and your breathing, and it controls characters in the games on the iPad app. It was targeted at like kids who have asthma and breathing difficulties, so they can kind of train to control their breath. But I did a lot of fun stuff at RGA anyway. So this is kind of some Arduino stuff that I did. And then I moved to the West Coast. I'm just going to grab my water and have a sip. Then I moved to the West Coast and worked with YouTube's virtual reality team, bringing YouTube to all of the various virtual reality platforms that are out there. It's hard to see what's going on here, but you put the headset on and it takes you to another world. And this year I've been working mainly with Google's Geo AR team, designing world-scale augmented reality. So this is some footage that we announced at Google I/O this year, and where we announced some of the projects that we're working on, including the Fox. So the Fox is the thing I've been working most closely with for the past 12 months. And this is an image of some of the user studies that we run at Google for world-scale AR. And I bring this up because I wanted to just kind of raise the point about how seriously Google takes research in the design process, and how seriously we focus on solving real user needs, particularly even in AR. We have like this really elegant process in AR and VR of research, and then coming up with a hypothesis, and then building a prototype that will solve or answer that hypothesis, and then taking that prototype into user studies and user testing, and then testing it with real people, and then taking those findings back to research, and then kind of starting that loop again. So we really go deep into research and prototype, research, prototype, trying to hone in on what the actual product problem is that we're trying to solve, what the actual user need and the user problem is. And that's how we build products at Google, AR and VR products, but also kind of products across the board. We're really thinking about solving user needs. So I blurred out some of the faces in this picture. Some of the other people are researchers and interaction designers who I worked with. This is on the streets in San Francisco. They're some of the smartest and most talented people I've ever worked with. So yeah, I really enjoyed my time there in San Francisco. And so this is my plug. I also wrote a book on this subject. It's called the Google Daydream VR Cookbook. And it will kind of ramp you up in your technical skills and help you prototype and build AR and VR experiences, but also give you like a solid foundation in the UX and design principles of AR and VR. So it's out now on Amazon. If you're into that kind of thing, check it out. That's the end of my plug. Cool. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about this concept, this idea of restart and restarting, and in particular in relation to research that I've done into the history of AR and VR, and in particular, the thing that I'm most interested in, this period of early media technology and how it parallels what we're doing today in digital media. And it seems to me that there's this repetition that happens throughout history within digital media and this kind of creative loop and within interaction design, whereby things from the distant past are repeated and this kind of restart of this historical loop. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So when I was writing my book, for the last couple of years, I've been really deep into researching the history of AR and VR. And I've been doing that not just for my book, but also because I think it's really important as a designer to understand kind of historical context and where things came from. I did a lot of research into the history of AR and VR and to kind of place it in a historic context and better understand the technologies. And I truly believe, and this is like one thing that I can impart onto you, is that if you're a designer, you really need to know the history. You cannot be a good designer unless you know where things came from. You cannot be just building things at the front and not understanding the back. So I've been reading a lot of media theory, and one guy who I've been reading is this guy called Lev Manovich, and he's an academic at NYU, and he writes a lot about the parallels between today's technology and the way we interact with computers and early media technology hundreds of years ago, and it's absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to talk a bit about that now because that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in, and hopefully it'll get your creative juices flowing. So, where was I? So you'll hear throughout my talk and throughout my research that there are these kind of consistent themes that align with Restart, in particular to do with this idea of like creative loops and historical loops that go back hundreds of years in innovation and invention, and they led to the emergence of virtual reality. And so hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll have a better understanding of these parallels and a better appreciation of this kind of period of early media pre-cinema animation devices and how it relates to digital media of today and the work that we're doing at Google on the future of computing, which we call immersive computing. So I'm going to talk a bit about AR and VR and what we call immersive computing at Google. If you're unfamiliar with this term, immersive computing, at Google, when we talk about AR and VR, we like to describe them as existing on a spectrum of immersive computing. So I feel really sorry for you because I'm like blocking you guys out and you can't see the slides, but it's okay. So on one end of the spectrum, we have real reality, and that's where we exist today. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have virtual reality, and so that's total simulation. And then at various points in the middle, we have augmented reality. And so that's where we place digital objects in the real world. And the point is that we don't think about AR and VR as being separate and competing technologies, but they're just labels for points on this spectrum of immersive computing. And so another way we like to talk about AR and VR at Google and the differences between them is we talk about VR as being able to transport you somewhere else. So you put your headset on and it takes you somewhere else. Whereas AR leaves you where you are and brings objects and information to you. So it surrounds your world with contextual information. And another thing we like to say is that it kind of imbues the user with superpowers. So it's fun to think when you're designing for immersive computing that you're actually designing superpowers for your users. And so that's a bit about how we talk about immersive computing at Google. All right, and so in my research for my book, it became clear to me that immersive computing and VR in particular came about at the intersection of three seemingly unrelated historical threads, and they're all just as fascinating as each other. And I'm going to split my talk up into three sections that talk about these three threads. And hopefully it won't turn into a horribly boring history lesson, but I find this endlessly inspiring, so let's kick it off. So these three threads that I'm going to talk about are pre-cinema animation. So this is the period of innovation that led up to the invention of cinema, and then early computing, so primitive computing, pre-mainframe computing, and then stereophotography, which is this early offshoot of normal photography. And these three things combine together to become virtual reality. So I'm going to start by taking us back 250 years and talk about a thing called pre-cinema animation. And if you're unfamiliar with the term pre-cinema animation, it's this wonderful period of technological innovation that led up to the invention of the Lumiere cinematograph and cinema itself. So In the 18th century, there were these amazing performances called phantasmagoria. And phantasmagoria were performances that were designed to frighten people. And so they take you out of your reality. And they contain, it's hard to see, but they contain projections of demons and spirits and ghosts, and there'd be smells and sounds, and people would scream and they would faint and they would run out of the theater because they'd never seen anything like it before. And to me, this seems like an early example of the cinematic experience. But more than that, people were escaping their reality in the same way that virtual reality takes you out of your reality today. So they're kind of an early example of the immersive experience. And so they were kind of traveling sideshows that would play on people's fears of demons and spirits, in the same way that, and the occult and the unknown, in the same way that we go to horror movies today, or we like play zombie video games today, because we kind of want to explore the periphery of where we feel comfortable, and we kind of want to go just outside of that and then be brought back in. So we do that today, and that's the same reason why people went to these back 200 years ago. And the really interesting innovation that came out of phantasmagoria, and it's hard to see here, but it was the popularization of the magic lantern. And so the magic lantern is this primitive projector that could project a single image. And so we have this concept of the projected image and then an audience who will consume it. So in the same way that we go to theaters today and we watch the projected image and we're the audience and we consume it, or we sit on the couch and we watch Netflix. And then in like the 1820s, we see the emergence of animation and the moving image. This is the first animation device. It's called the thermotrope. And it's a 2-frame animation. It's an additive animation, like a proto-animation. If you're unfamiliar with the thermotrope, you draw a bird on one side and a cage on the other, and you flip it really quickly, and it looks like the bird is in the cage. But the thing that this brought about was an understanding of this concept of the persistence of vision. And we all know that persistence of vision is kind of the underlying phenomenon that is all screen-based technology is based on today. And so then we start to see all of these other devices come out. And my favorite is the phenakistoscope in 1833. And so the phenakistoscope is a handheld device. Notice the use of language, so it's handheld. We're still using handheld devices today. And you swipe it with a swipe gesture to spin it. So notice the use of language again. And you look through these slits, and you can see a looping animation. So there are 3 things that the phenakistoscope heralded, 3 major achievements that lead up to kind of motion graphics of today. And they are, the first thing is this idea of looping animation. So no one had seen animation before this. And the second thing is this invention of the primitive shutter system. So you have these slits and you can look through it, and what it does is it breaks up the image into discrete frames of animation. And then the third thing is like an evolution of the understanding of this phenomenon of persistence of vision. And so we know those 3 things are kind of foundational to like all of the screen-based technology that we use today, but also these devices just stand alone as like beautiful artistic and design pieces. And they're always really kind of bizarre and kind of racy and a little bit pornographic, so they show a bit of leg, a bit of stocking. Because it's important to remember these weren't devices for kids, they were for adults. So this is pre-cinema and pre-television. So adults would go into the parlor and they'd drink some gin or they'd drink some sherry, and the aristocracy, of course, because if you were poor, you just work and sleep. And you look at these devices. And they're always really bizarre. And the thing that blows me away about them is just this amazingly rich animation that you can get from such a small unit of visual information. And so that leads us to the zoetrope, which is the more well-known of these devices, in 1865. And so the zoetrope continued this idea of continuous looping animation and this shutter system, this primitive shutter system. And so these devices are just beautiful. Like, look at this thing. It's kind of falling apart, and there's these reels of film down here. And so at this point in this talk, it's important for me to kind of take a step back and let's analyze the similarities between these devices and the stuff that we're doing today. So the first thing that stands out to me is the content, so the looping animation. And so sometimes it's titillating, sometimes it's offensive. And that reminds me a lot of GIF animations of today. And so then the second thing, the parallel that I see is the language that's used. So these are handheld devices. We interact with them with swipe gestures. This is possibly a desktop device. And then if you look at the objects themselves, this is kind of a media player, and then you have media storage over here. So you've got this idea of disk-based storage. You slot your disk in, and you can animate it. And continuing that theme, this analogy of computing, if you look at the shape of the zoetrope, it's a cylinder. Today, if you rip apart any hard drive, it's a compressed cylinder. It spins really fast, and then we read binary data off it in the same way that we read binary animation data from this thing. And then you can look at the strips, and you can like go deeper and deeper into like, they look like film, and then they look like this is how we store binary data on magnetic strips. And I'm not just making tenuous connections here. This really is the first time that we interacted with animated media in the same way that today we interact with animated media and games on our phones and YouTube or what have you. This is just a really primitive version of that. And then there was like a whole proliferation of these devices, and they all have really complicated scientific names. Because again, these weren't toys for kids. They were like, they started to become serious scientific achievements. Well, the inventors wanted to be known as serious scientists. And then this is the praxinoscope of 1877. And the interesting thing about this is we move away from these slits for a shutter system into mirrors. And so we know that like all projection-based media technology and cameras today is based around mirrors. So this is the first time we see that. And then we see a whole series of these devices that are based around the flip book. And so this is the mutoscope in 1889. And the really interesting thing about this is that it used a carousel. And so the carousel meant that it could extend the animation time. So the larger the carousel, the longer the animation. And the other really interesting thing is that we're starting to see the inventors breaking down the animation into separate frames. So instead of having a strip that you kind of spin, they're thinking about how can we evolve this, how can we make a more efficient system of animation. They understand the persistence of vision phenomenon, so they'll break things down, and all you need is a single frame that flips really quickly. So this device worked by looking into this viewport at the top right, and then you crank the wheel, and it would turn the carousel, and you see this kind of flip book animation. And then we start to see, this is the zoo praxiscope. It's kind of difficult to see here, but the combination of projections and animation. So the carousels start to get larger, so we're trying to extend the animation, and you can see we have an audience who's consuming this. So think back to the Magic Lantern. We had a single projection. Now we have a projection of animation. So that's kind of the important moment here. And it's almost like the inventors and the engineers knew what they were trying to aim for. They're trying to get this holy grail of cinema and long-form projected animation and moving image. But they just didn't know how to get there. They were like, all the pieces are in place, and they had to put them together. And so this is kind of a step on the way. And this is another zoopraxiscope. This is projections and animation mixed together, and it's just a beautiful piece of engineering. And then we meet Eardwood Muybridge. I'm jumping around a bit here. This is his chronophotography of 1872. And these are kind of temporal, spatial montages. I imagine everyone is familiar with these. But at first glance, they kind of seem like a step back from the trajectory of the moving image. But when you consider them a bit more, they're really just strips of film, like laid out in sequence. And so the other thing that I find really interesting is the subject matter is of human form and human movement, and they're kind of scientific studies, anthropological studies. But again, the most important thing for me and this talk is this is the first time we start to see frames of animation laid out sequentially. So it's kind of like a mind shift from how things were previous. And then that leads us to the Lumiere cinematograph, of course. We all know this is like the first film projector and film camera in 1895. And it's combined into one. They didn't know that you were supposed to have a separate camera and a separate projector. And this kind of leads us to this holy grail of long-form moving image. And the breakthrough technology that allowed that was the invention of the reel of film, which sounds kind of weird. And so the reel of film allowed this kind of essentially endless animation, endless continuous animation, as opposed to a carousel, which can get larger and larger, and at some point it has to loop, or the strips of the zoetrope, which just allow short forms, GIF animations. And the other really interesting thing about the reel of film is we see it pop up later in media technology, media history, because not only is it a really efficient system for storing frames of animation and projecting them, but it's also a really elegant system for storing and retrieving binary data in computers. So we'll see that pop up in like early computing. And so I'm going to talk a bit about early computing, and I know this sounds really dry, but it's not. There are a lot of really interesting kind of overlaps in media history and technology and parallels to today. And so starting with the Babbage analytical engine in 1837, this used punch cards. And the really interesting thing about punch cards is that they were taken from textile looms. So textile looms use punch cards to program patterns into, like weaving patterns into materials. And so we see this really interesting crossover between seemingly unrelated media and technology. So we have fashion and textiles overlapping with mathematics and computing to create this really interesting primitive computer. And then skipping to 1880 is the invention of what is generally considered to be the first computer, and that's the tabulator by this guy called Herman Hollerith. And it used punch cards as well. And so it was used to tabulate all of the US Census data in the 1880s. And Herman Hollerith's company, International Business Machines, would go on to become IBM, and then which we know like founded the PC revolution. But it's fun for me to think that the PCs of today are just kind of advanced textile looms. And then skipping ahead, there's this other really interesting overlap of media and technology when Alan Turing devises the universal Turing machine in 1936. And the really interesting thing about this is he moves away from punch cards and he replaces it with reels of film. So we see this kind of, it's absolute like facsimile of the Lumiere cinematograph is now being applied to computing. And it's absolutely no coincidence that it happened, that 40 years earlier, the Lumiere brothers had unwittingly discovered this system that's not only really efficient for storing and retrieving frames of film and projecting them, but it's also really efficient for storing binary data. And so this is really interesting. For me, there's this really interesting crossover between pre-cinema animation turning into like mainframe computing. So if you look at these are just canisters of film. This is from the 1960s. It's a mainframe room. And you've got this projector up the back, but it's really a computer. And then you've got like textile looms turning into the modern PC. And so these kind of weird overlaps and morphing and mutating. And then the other really, and then the third thread that led to virtual reality is stereoptics, and you can see all of these really interesting overlaps in stereoptics and stereophotography as well. So the first stereophotography came about soon after the invention of photography, the daguerreotype in 1839, because the mathematics was known for a long time, and in the Renaissance they created stereo images, illustrations. Michelangelo and Da Vinci had done all of this stuff, but it wasn't until we invented photography that we could, of course, apply it to stereo photography. And then soon after that we have the first stereo viewers, and they look like this. So this is you used mirrors, and they have to be quite large because you want the focal length to be about 0.5 meter away, otherwise it's too blurry. And so it used mirrors. That wasn't until this guy called Brewster in 1849 invented the first stereoscope that used lenses. And so what that did was it magnified the image, so you could bring it right up close. And the thing that I find fascinating about this image, it looks identical to a VR headset of today. So this is actually the form factor of virtual reality was locked in 170 years ago. The only difference is that we have more up-to-date computer graphics and animation. And then stereo optics move into the mainstream with the Viewmaster in the 30s. And then 3D becomes popularized in the drive-in in the 50s with like the disposable 3D glasses. And then we start to see this kind of really interesting convergence of these three seemingly unrelated threads of pre-cinema animation, so spinning discs mixing with early computing, like primitive computing, so textile looms and strips of film, mixing with like stereo optics, like putting lenses in your eyes, this weird shit that no one knew what was going on, merging together and turning into computer graphics and virtual reality. And one of the more interesting moments in the history of virtual reality that I like to highlight is this, the invention of this machine called the Sensorama. And it's essentially a proto-arcade machine that promises to take you to another world. I love these call-outs down the bottom. It contains aromas, wind, and vibrations. So you stick your head in this box and you're riding on the back of a motorbike around 1950s, 1960s Brooklyn, and it's got like a stereoscope, so it's stereo film, and you hold onto the handlebars and it vibrates, and it like blows wind in your face. Here's some more product shots, including the obligatory sexist 1960s shot of the woman standing by her Sensorama. But this is a really important moment in virtual reality for me because of its vision of what virtual reality could become. So up until this point, and even today, we think about virtual reality as this like really serious technological achievement. We like serious engineering. But really, virtual reality lives in gaming and it lives in entertainment. And so I feel like this kind of hits the mark with that. And then talking about serious engineering, we come to the invention of the first VR headset in 1968 by this guy called Ivan Sutherland at the University of Utah. It's generally known as the Sword of Damocles because of this pole that hangs down from the roof and kind of lifts up your headset because it was so heavy. And so I reached out to Ivan Sutherland when I was writing my book because I wanted permission to use these images. And just as an aside, he's a very famous computer scientist and engineer, very well respected. He's invented a bunch of stuff beyond the virtual reality headset, and he received the Turing Award for Computer Science, which is kind of like the Nobel Prize for computer science. And he wrote me, anyway, so I reached out to him because I wanted permission to use these images of him wearing. He wrote back this email and he said, it's not actually called the Sword of Damocles, that's a common misnomer. The only thing that was called the Sword of Damocles is this pole hanging from the roof. The head-mounted display, they just called the head-mounted display. And he said, you have permission to use these images, but for God's sake, get the name right. So I'm just gonna update this now with the head-mounted display from 1968. If you Google it today, the first VR headset, it'll definitely say the Sword of Damocles. So I feel like that ship might have sailed. And so this is where my interest in technology and the history of technology starts to wane. I'm not really interested in the stuff that came after this, like PC wars and mobile technology. I'm really interested in this like weird shit that happened before people knew what they were doing, where people were kind of like spinning discs and making computers out of strips of film and mixing it with these lenses in your eyes and kind of coming up with like modern computing of today. So I'm going to leave it there in terms of the history lesson, but I just want to kind of recap the thesis of my research that focused on pre-cinema animation devices. So this is this early period of technological innovation that led up to the invention of cinema. And then early computing, so like primitive computing, so like strips of film and like textile looms, and stereoptics, which is this kind of weird offshoot of photography, and these weird, strange things kind of merged together and formed and turned into virtual reality. So I'll just leave you with a couple of points. Hopefully the thesis of my research is clear that all this awesome stuff happened back in the day, and there are like parallels between what happened then and the work that we're doing now in terms of language and interaction and technology and design and concepts. And I'll just leave you with one point, which is something that I think about a lot when I'm working in this field. And I imagine a lot of people here are also working in digital. You're designers, you're artists, you're working in gaming or web design or mobile apps. And we often think that we're working at the cutting edge and we're at the forefront, and this has never been done before. We're coming up with new design systems and new interactions and new paradigms. But I put it to you that none of this is new, and that there is historical precedence for everything that's happened. And all that is happening now is the restart of a historical loop, just with more up-to-date technology. So that's all I've got to say. Hopefully it wasn't just a boring history lesson. I'm endlessly fascinated with this stuff. So thanks a lot for listening, and thanks to the team for putting this on. That's a really interesting question. So the question is there kind of, is the work that I'm doing now a part of like another loop of history that's going to come together and form something new? I don't know. I like to think so, but I almost see it as kind of a continuum that just forms over time. Like, this is like media, and it's almost like an evolution of media, and it's this organic matter that just forms. But I like to think that we're at the start of something new, and that we're like forming this new thing. So, yeah. Well, I hope so, yeah.
Some of those names were really, really convoluted. Is there any reason, like I can't even remember half of them. Like, is there any reason why they were so complex and so long?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is there any reason why the names are really difficult? And it's absolutely like a fascinating part of the history, because these inventors in the 18th, the 19th century were taking their work really seriously. And so they wanted to be seen as serious scientists and serious engineers, but they weren't really. They were really just building these toys for kids. And so this is kind of the language around it was like praxinoscope and zoopraxinoscope. It comes from like Latin and Greek. And so that's the reason why that the language is so kind of weird and complicated. But I think today we'd have different names of things. So, hey.
A lot of the obstacles we face in getting clients across AR and VR solutions come down to the user experience. It can be really complicated.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we're looking at the moment is around browser-based applications of it. I'm just interested from your point of view as someone at Google, how things are going in that regard, because I'm hearing mixed reports.
Yeah, so the question is, how is Google working towards browser-based AR, VR, compared to like native AR and VR? And it's a really good question. So we're investing big on both. Clearly, Google kind of works mainly in the open web, as opposed to Apple, which works in the kind of the closed Apple silo. But we're also working natively, so we're investing big in native AR and also web-based AR. I mean, and you have to kind of imagine the future of the web and the future of like immersive computing and the future of AR and VR technology is at some point going to become open. So I think that, talking from Google, we wouldn't kind of talk about those as being competing, but we can talk about it afterwards.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, over here.
Hi.
You mentioned before the crossover between like textiles and fashion with these new emerging technologies. How do you see that moving forward in our current days?
I don't know, because I'm not an expert at that, but I see a lot of people working in that field, and I think it's amazing. So there's clearly this, like the thing that I'm interested in kind of is like just looking at the historical threads, and I see that thread continuing. I didn't have time to talk about that now, but there definitely is like this continuation of, in wearables. So I worked for a while in wearables, and also kind of the creative arts and fashion and textiles and technology. Yeah, so I don't know. I think it's going to continue, but I think that in terms of wearables, from my experience working in wearables, they're very difficult it's very difficult to get people in the mainstream to wear something every day just for the sake of wearing it, unless you give them a lot of value. And so a lot of the fitness trackers don't offer a lot of value, and the technology is still too primitive to be able to do like heart measurements and analyze your blood. So I think that until we can add like real value in terms of wearables, then it'll just kind of be a thing on the periphery. But I think that at some point, wearables and fashion and textiles and technology are going to become mainstream for sure.
All right, last question.
I suppose that a lot of these examples were really use cases for entertainment.
Yeah.
As you see today, AR especially has a lot of use cases beyond entertainment, but how do you see it's going to fulfill that objective, or it's going to stay really that more entertainment, VR, gaming?
Right. So the question is, VR and AR is very focused on entertainment. How do we see these technologies moving out of kind of gaming and entertainment into kind of the mainstream and like useful utilities? So the way we're thinking about AR and developing AR in particular, we're trying to meet the users where they are. So at Google, we're not building headsets. We're focusing on mobile phone AR. So we're not trying to change the human behavior. So everyone has a phone, and so we're meeting you where you are, and we're trying to solve real user problems. So I showed you some examples earlier of the stuff we're doing with Geo, where we're trying to help people navigate with AR. And I can't go too deep into it because it hasn't been released yet. But it's definitely something that we're thinking about. And so we're trying to kind of focus on solving real user problems as opposed to creating gimmicks and meet users where they are, which is on the mobile phone.
Thank you. I have one very, very sneaky last question for you, which is, you've done some incredible stuff. You've worked on amazing products. You've worked at RGA in New York and now Google. What's next? I mean, do you have a goal or a dream or something that you would really love to do? And I went and met Sam out at Google. And once you work at Google, like, where do you go from there? So tell us what's next.
Well, there's like several things. So like what I'm doing at Google is really interesting now. We're working in AR, and it's like the future of computing. So that'll kind of continue on in a stream. The thing I'm really interested in though is the history. And so I almost want to like quit my job and like just become an academic and like study history. So that might be, but I have a daughter now, and so I'm really just kind of bringing her up, and I'm not letting her use technology until she's 15. So that's where I'm at.
There's a whole other talk in there.
Yeah.
Guys, give Sam a huge round of applause.
Cool, thanks a lot.